On the 2nd of June 2026, at its annual Build Developer Conference, Microsoft's Windows chief stood on stage and announced something that would have been genuinely unthinkable a decade ago. More than 75 Linux commands, the exact tools that Linux users have run on open source systems for 30 years, were now built natively into Windows, not hidden inside a compatibility layer, not requiring a virtual machine to run. Just there, on Windows, working exactly the way they work on Linux. Commands like ls, grep, cat, cp, mv, and rm, the basic vocabulary of Linux computing, now running natively on the operating system whose former CEO once publicly called Linux a cancer. That is not a product update. That is a concession. And if you understand the full history of how Microsoft got here, the announcement looks less like innovation and more like the final chapter of a war Microsoft spent 25 years fighting and ultimately lost. Let's start with the number that anchors everything else in this story. In 2020, Microsoft's president Brad Smith said publicly at an MIT event, Microsoft was on the wrong side of history when open source exploded at the beginning of the century. That was not a casual comment from a junior spokesperson. Brad Smith had been at the company for 25 years by the time he said it. He had personally fought in the legal battles surrounding open source software. He knew exactly what he was saying, and he said it anyway, on the record, using the phrase wrong side of history, the kind of language that does not get approved by a corporate communications team without deliberate intent. Compare that to 2001, when then CEO Steve Ballmer described Linux and open source software as a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. Cancer in 2001. Wrong side of history in 2020. Linux commands built natively into Windows in 2026. That trajectory tells you something important about the actual balance of power in computing right now, and it tells you something even more important about the cost of choosing the wrong side of it for 25 years. To understand what the Build 2026 announcement actually means, you need to understand the war that preceded it, because that war has a very specific timeline and a very specific set of moves that most coverage of this announcement glosses over entirely. After Ballmer's 2001 cancer comment, Microsoft didn't just express concern about Linux in public statements. It acted on that concern in increasingly aggressive ways. The company funded SEO Group's legal attack on Linux, a prolonged lawsuit that attempted to establish that Linux infringed on Unix copyrights, aiming to create legal uncertainty that would slow enterprise adoption. It ran public campaigns questioning Linux's total cost of ownership, commissioning studies specifically designed to show that Windows was cheaper than it appeared when you factored in support and administration costs. It pressured governments and enterprises to stay on Windows rather than switch to open source alternatives. The campaign was sustained, well-resourced, and in the words of technology publications that covered all of it in real time, rather extreme and unpleasant. That is the polite version. The internal version is documented in what became known as the Halloween documents, leaked Microsoft memos from 1998 that explicitly named a strategy called Embrace, Extend, Extinguish, adopt an open standard, add proprietary extensions on top, make the proprietary version the default, and watch the original standard lose relevance. These weren't speculative accusations from outside critics. They were Microsoft's own internal strategy documents, naming the strategy in plain language. Then, Satya Nadella became CEO in 2014, and the company's views on Linux began a complete reversal. Not instantly, not cleanly, but in stages, each one going a little further than the last. Microsoft open-sourced the .NET framework, something that would have been genuinely unthinkable under Ballmer. It joined the Open Invention Network, the patent pool created specifically to protect Linux from intellectual property attacks, an organization that had existed partly in response to Microsoft's own earlier campaigns against Linux adoption. It acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion and kept it running as a genuinely open platform rather than folding it into Microsoft's existing product stack. It open-sourced Visual Studio Code. It began contributing to the Linux kernel directly, and in 2016 it announced the Windows Subsystem for Linux, a way to run Linux command line tools and utilities directly on Windows without needing a virtual machine or a dual boot setup. When WSL first launched, it felt experimental, a curious proof of concept from a company still figuring out what its new relationship with Linux actually meant. By 2025, it had become foundational, something developers expected to be there, not something they were surprised to find. The real turning point, though, is not Build 2026. It's a GitHub issue that was opened on the 6th of April 2016, the same week WSL was first announced. Issue number 1 in the WSL repository, asking a very simple question: will this be open source? That issue sat open for 9 years. Developers commented on it, checked it, updated it, and watched it as a living document of a promise Microsoft had not yet made. And then at Build 2025, Microsoft closed it. The company announced that WSL was now open source, After nearly a decade of development, with community contributions that had already grown to over 200 pull requests per month, even before the source code was made publicly available. Read that again. Developers had been contributing to a project whose source code they couldn't see, building features and fixing bugs through reverse engineering and trust. And when Microsoft finally opened the code, it acknowledged that the community had already shaped the project in spirit, even without access to the actual source. That is what winning a 25-year argument looks like in practice. Not a formal declaration, not a press conference, a 9-year-old GitHub issue getting closed with a yes. 1 year later, Build 2026 took the next step. The core utils announcement, 75 Linux commands built natively into Windows, was the logical conclusion of a trajectory that had been accelerating for several years, but it still landed as a meaningful statement, both technically and symbolically. The tools include commands like cat, cp, find, grep, hostname, ls, mv, pwd, rm, sleep, and uptime. The day-to-day verbs of command line work that Linux and Unix users have built their workflows around for 30 years. The project is based on the open source utils project, a cross-platform re-implementation of the classic GNU core utilities written in the Rust-T programming language. That technical choice matters more than it might appear. Microsoft didn't write these tools from scratch, and it didn't simply repackage a compatibility layer. It built on an existing open source project with genuine technical credibility and packaged it as a native Windows feature, compiled natively for Windows, respecting Windows path conventions and line endings, and designed to perform like a first-class part of the operating system, rather than an afterthought port. Microsoft has pledged to maintain and update this implementation alongside Windows going forward. That's a commitment, not just a press release, and it means these tools aren't going to disappear in 2 versions the way previous Windows features sometimes quietly did. Alongside the core utils announcement came another one that received considerably less attention in the coverage: WSL containers, a built-in way to create, run, and interact with Linux containers directly on Windows, providing native command line and API tools for container workflows without requiring third-party software. Docker has long been the dominant platform for developers running Linux containers on Windows machines. Microsoft just built an alternative into the operating system itself. That's not a coincidence. That's a company identifying every remaining workflow reason a developer might need to step outside Windows, and systematically eliminating those reasons one by one. The message from Build 2026, taken as a whole, is unambiguous. Microsoft is done asking developers to choose between Windows and Linux workflows. That position, the insistence that Windows developers should accept a different mental model for their work, ran out of road, and Microsoft has decided to move toward where the developers already are, rather than continuing to insist they should come back. It's worth being honest about why Microsoft is doing this, because the company's stated framing, making Windows a trusted platform for development, is accurate but incomplete. The fuller explanation is that developers have been leaving Windows, or avoiding it because modern development workflows are increasingly Linux native. Linux is the operating system of the cloud, of containers, of AI infrastructure, of the production environments, where almost everything ultimately runs. Microsoft's Azure Cloud, the company's own infrastructure that it sells to enterprise customers, reported 61.8% Linux virtual machine usage across active subscriptions in 2025, meaning even the cloud platform Microsoft builds and sells runs primarily on Linux, not Windows. Every time a developer working on Windows had to reach for WSL because a native Windows environment didn't speak the language they needed, every script that had to be rewritten, every tool that worked in Bash but had no clean equivalent in PowerShell, every explanation to a manager about why the development environment and the production environment worked differently, it was a moment where Windows failed to earn its place in that developer's workflow. The core utils announcement is Microsoft's attempt to stop accumulating those moments. There is a specific human cost to the gap that existed, and it deserves to be named directly. Think about the systems administrator who spent 20 years deeply competent in the Windows ecosystem, group policy, Active Directory, PowerShell, or the full stack, and then watched their company's infrastructure migrate to the cloud over the course of a decade. The servers went to Azure, and what ran on Azure was increasingly not Windows. He had to learn a new language in the second half of his career, not by choice, and not because he went looking for something new, but because the industry moved. The tools the industry moved to were Linux tools, grep, bash, SSH, the command line vocabulary that Microsoft had spent decades treating as beneath the dignity of a modern operating system. For this person, and millions like him, the core utils announcement arrives after the fact. The muscle memory has already been built. The Linux command line has already been learned. The transition cost has already been paid. And now Microsoft is putting those commands into Windows and presenting it as a feature, as if the friction that created the transition cost in the first place was simply an unfortunate gap that has now been thoughtfully addressed. That framing elides a great deal of what the gap actually cost real people in real time. For the people who got tired of explaining it, who switched to Linux or to Mac and never looked back, this announcement is too late. That's not cynicism, it's just accurate. The WSL era papered over the gap well enough to keep a significant population of developers on Windows, but it preserved the underlying conceptual separation. Real Unix-like work happened inside a Linux layer, even if that layer lived inside Windows. The commands in a terminal window were Linux commands running inside a Linux environment that happened to be hosted by Windows. That is not the same thing as those commands being native to Windows, and developers working at the intersection of Windows and Linux environments felt that distinction in their daily work, even if they couldn't always articulate exactly why. The honest read on what Microsoft has done here involves both genuine credit and genuine skepticism, and both sides of that ledger deserve to be taken seriously. The credit first. Building 75 Linux commands natively into Windows is not trivial engineering. The decision to base it on the Rust-implemented utils project, rather than writing a one-off, port shows technical seriousness. The commitment to maintain it as a first-class Windows feature rather than leaving it to atrophy is a real pledge. The decision to open source WSL after 9 years of community pressure was a genuine change, not performative. The community had already demonstrated what trust in that project looked like, and Microsoft eventually honored it. Community contributions growing to over 200 pull requests per month before the source was even public tells you that developers believed in the project enough to invest in it without the usual assurances. The skepticism is also legitimate, and anyone who has watched Microsoft's history with open standards owes it to themselves to hold it. Microsoft's own internal documents name the Embrace, Extend, Extinguish strategy explicitly. The Halloween documents weren't invented by critics. They were leaked from inside the company. The question any experienced observer has to sit with is whether what's happening now is genuine convergence or a more sophisticated version of the same move at a different scale. When Microsoft puts Linux commands inside Windows, it keeps developers on Windows. It keeps them paying for Windows licenses, running Windows Update, subject to Windows telemetry, and dependent on Microsoft's decisions about which Linux functionality to include and what to leave out. Some commands that conflict with existing Windows built-ins were excluded from the core utils implementation. Others were dropped as not applicable to the Windows environment. POSIX-specific commands like chmod, chown, and crontab are absent, deliberately, because they don't map cleanly onto Windows concepts. The version of Linux that lives inside Windows is always going to be Microsoft's version of Linux, curated, bounded, maintained on Microsoft's schedule, updated when Microsoft decides to update it, and permanently shaped by the requirement to coexist with the Windows environment rather than replace it. That is a real limitation, and it matters for anyone who needs the full power of an actual Linux system, rather than a carefully curated selection of its most developer-friendly tools. And yet, for the audience sitting in front of a Windows machine wondering whether any of this is relevant to their actual life, the Build 2026 announcement is a signal worth reading clearly. The company that spent 25 years calling Linux a legal threat, funding campaigns to discredit it, pressuring enterprises to avoid it, and then gradually, grudgingly, incrementally integrating it into its own products, has now embedded Linux's actual vocabulary into its operating system as a native feature. That is not something you do because the competition lost. You do not ship your competitors' core tools as a built-in part of your own product because you won the argument. You do it because the argument ended and the result was not what you had predicted. Come back to the 2nd of June 2026, a stage at Microsoft Build. A Windows chief announcing 75 Linux commands built natively into Windows. A Linux subsystem open, sourced to the community it had quietly depended on for 9 years. Linux containers built directly into the operating system as a first-class feature, not a third-party add-on. In 2001, the CEO of this company called Linux a cancer. In 2020, its president said Microsoft was on the wrong side of history. In 2026, the company shipped Linux's vocabulary as a core Windows feature, maintained and updated, available to every Windows user, without any additional setup required. That is not innovation. That is the conclusion of a 25-year argument. Linux won the argument, and Microsoft updated the product to reflect that, which is, when you think about it, about the most complete acknowledgment of being wrong that a company of that size is capable of making in public without calling a press conference specifically to say so. What it means going forward is not yet fully written. The core utils implementation is real and useful as far as it goes. The limitations are also real, and understanding both sides honestly is how you make a decision that actually fits your specific situation. Whether you're a developer evaluating workflows, a sysadmin managing mixed environments, or someone running Windows 10 wondering what the next few years look like. The announcement changes the practical calculus in some ways and leaves other things entirely unchanged. But the symbolic weight of it is not nothing. When the company that called Linux a cancer decides that the path forward requires shipping Linux's tools as a native part of its own operating system, the question of who won that particular argument has been answered as thoroughly as these things ever get answered in the technology industry. Not with a press release, but with a product decision. Let's be more specific about what that product decision actually includes and where its edges are, because the headline number, 75 commands, tells you something, but not everything. The specific tools in the initial release cover the commands that matter most for day-to-day development work: file navigation and manipulation through ls, cp, mv, rm, mkdir, and cat, text processing through grep, find, and similar utilities, system information through hostname, uptime, and pwd, and basic scripting, primitives through sleep and t. These are the commands that come up in tutorials, that live in shell scripts, that developers type from muscle memory and expect to behave consistently across environments. For someone whose primary frustration with Windows as a development environment has been that these commands either didn't exist or behaved differently when invoked in PowerShell through compatibility shims, the native implementation is a meaningful practical improvement, not just a symbolic gesture. The commands that are absent tell an equally informative story. Ahmad, chown, crontab, and similar POSIX-specific tools that map directly onto the Unix permission model and process scheduling architecture. These are not in the Windows native implementation, and they're not in it for a reason that goes beyond a simple oversight. The Unix permission model and Windows access control model are fundamentally different architectures, and a native Windows implementation of commode would either be a meaningless stub that doesn't actually do anything with Windows file permissions, or it would require building a compatibility layer at the kernel level that is essentially a different project entirely. This is the real ceiling of what Linux commands on Windows can mean. While Windows is still architecturally Windows, the surface level vocabulary can be replicated, the deep structural assumptions cannot, at least not without effectively turning Windows into something it isn't. For scripting, for cross-platform development workflows, for reducing the friction of switching contexts between environments, the 75 commands accomplish a lot. For anyone whose actual work requires the full Unix model rather than its most portable surface, anyone working seriously with permissions, process management, or deeply POSIX-dependent software, the gap remains real and is unlikely to close on the Windows native path. That caveat matters most for understanding who this announcement actually serves and who it doesn't quite reach: the developer, who spends most of their time in a code editor, running build systems, testing against containerized environments, and deploying to cloud infrastructure, gets a meaningfully better experience on Windows after build 2026 than they had before. The friction points that have been sending that developer toward Linux or Mac for years have been reduced, not eliminated, but reduced in specific, targeted ways that correspond to the actual daily annoyances. The developer who has already built their entire workflow on a native Linux system and relies on the Unix permission model, the Linux process model, and the full GNU toolchain for their work gets something slightly different. Confirmation that the gap they crossed when they left Windows is narrower than it used to be, but confirmation that they're not being asked to cross back. It's also worth tracing the arc of this shift at the developer community level, not just the corporate decision level, because the community's relationship with Microsoft's open source moves has followed a clear pattern that this announcement continues. When WSL first launched in 2016, the reception from serious Linux users ranged from cautious to outright dismissive. It was seen as a thin compatibility play, an attempt to reduce one of the main practical arguments for switching to Linux, without addressing any of the underlying reasons developers were dissatisfied with Windows as a development environment. Over time, as WSL improved, as Microsoft's contributions to upstream Linux projects accumulated, and as the open source commitment became more concrete and consistent, that skepticism moderated for many people without fully disappearing. The open sourcing of WSL at Build 2025 was the first move that felt like it resolved a specific, long-standing specific point of tension, the 9-year-old GitHub issue, in a way that was hard to read as anything other than genuine. The core utils announcement at Build 2026 lands in the context of that accumulated credibility, which is a different context than the 2016 WSL launch existed in. The community's posture toward Microsoft's Linux moves in 2026 is measurably different from what it was in 2016, not because the skepticism was wrong to exist then, but because the evidence base for evaluating these moves has grown substantially. None of this rewrites the history of the 25 years before it, and it shouldn't. The SEO lawsuit funding, the total cost of ownership studies, the enterprise pressure campaigns, the FUD, the acronym that circulated through Linux communities for years, standing for fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the toolset Microsoft deployed against open source adoption. All of that happened. It had real costs, and it delayed Linux adoption in specific markets in specific ways that are genuinely hard to quantify, but impossible to pretend didn't exist. The people who built careers around Linux during those years, who dealt with the legal uncertainty Microsoft helped create, who had to fight internal battles at companies where the Microsoft FUD had taken hold, they're owed an accurate accounting of what happened, not a narrative where the current product direction retroactively reframes the earlier opposition as merely a misunderstanding. Brad Smith's wrong side of history comment was as close to that accurate accounting as a company president is likely to get in a public setting. And it's worth treating seriously, precisely because he was one of the people who had participated in the legal battles he was describing. What the Build 2026 announcement adds to that accounting is not an erasure of the history, but a confirmation of its conclusion. The side that called Linux a cancer is now shipping Linux commands as a native part of its operating system. The side that funded legal attacks on Linux now open sources the Linux compatibility layer it built and acknowledges the community that shaped it. The side that commissioned studies showing Linux's total cost of ownership was too high now runs the most used cloud platform in the world on Linux at a 61.8% rate across active virtual machine subscriptions. These are not minor adjustments to a position. They are a complete reversal of it, arrived at incrementally, never quite announced as such, but visible in aggregate with unmistakable clarity. For someone sitting in front of a Windows machine right now, trying to figure out what this practically means for how they work, the clearest takeaway is this: the case for staying on Windows as a development environment is meaningfully stronger in June 2026 than it was in June 2025, and considerably stronger than it was at any point before WSL existed. That doesn't mean Windows is the right choice for every developer or every workflow. The full Linux system, with all the architectural depth and flexibility that entails, remains something you can only get on a full Linux system. No curated subset of its command line tools running natively on a different operating system changes that fundamental reality. But the Windows can't do what Linux does argument, which was a completely accurate summary of the situation for most of the 2010s, now needs to be qualified in ways it didn't use to need qualifying. And that qualification matters for anyone making decisions about their tools in 2026. Microsoft didn't announce that Linux won on the 2nd of June 2026. It announced 75 Linux commands, an open source subsystem, and native container support. But when you know what it took to get there, the 25 years of opposition, the 9-year-old GitHub issue, the president's on-the-record admission, the cloud platform that runs on Linux rather than the operating system the company sells, the announcement says something the company didn't quite say out loud. The argument is over. The product reflects who won it. And that, more than any specific technical feature, is what this announcement actually means.